We recently discussed on this show a Q&A from our good friend Dr. William Lane Craig, discussing his understanding of divine simplicity. And I appreciate Dr. Craig taking the time to actually interact with our discussion on one of his recent podcasts. In addition, Dr. James White made a short video also sharing his thoughts on this interaction as well. So today we're joined again by Dr. Brian Huffling to respond to some of the comments from both of these brothers and hopefully help clear up some misconceptions, some misunderstandings about divine simplicity in the process. So I hope you enjoy another discussion on divine simplicity. We do think it's an important topic to make sure we have a clear understanding about, and certainly want to clear up any misunderstandings on what exactly we teach here at SES. So stick around for this discussion. I think it'll be a good one. I'm Adam Tucker with Southern Evangelical Seminary, and this is Why Do You Believe? Well, welcome back again to another episode of Why Do You Believe, the podcast and live stream of Southern Evangelical Seminary. Hope you're enjoying our content, and as always, we would encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Make sure you're getting notifications like this video, like our Facebook page, so you know what's going on when we're going live, what content we're dealing with. And as always, you can visit ses.edu. Click on the media tab there. You can download our SES mobile app for all the archives of our shows. We use the audio for podcasts if you would prefer to interact with the content in that way, and usually post blogs related to the subjects we're talking about as well. So again, you can find all of that at ses.edu. And the mobile app, I should say, contains over, I think, 500 hours worth of apologetics content from this show, from our national conference archives, and a lot of other stuff. So please be sure to check that out. Well, we want to just jump right into the material today, and I'm going to look over and make sure we are live and everything's going. So it looks like we're good to go. Switch shots here and bring in our guest, Dr. Brian Huffling, who is no stranger to this show. Dr. Huffling, as most of you probably know, is an SES alum, and he also serves as the current director of the PhD program. And in addition, appropriately enough for, the 5th of July now, but close enough to the 4th of July, he's a deputy wing chaplain at Dobbins Air Reserve Base. Dr. Huffling, thank you for being with us, and we appreciate your service.
Thank you very much.
Happy 4th of July or 5th of July to you. And truly, we appreciate all that you're doing for our country and for proclaiming the gospel. So tell us a bit about yourself, what you're up to right now, what are you working on, what's new since last time we chatted?
Well, I've been working on a book with Michael Shermer and, I guess I can say this, Michael Shermer and Gary Wittenberger and a couple other folks, Jim Sturber is one of them, on an outgrowth of the debate we had with Michael Shermer back in 2019. That was between him and me, about the problem of evil and God's existence. And it really focused on, is God a moral kind of being that is obligated to prevent evil? And that got sent on to his magazine. We had a back and forth in his magazine. And then we got the book at a publisher right now. I published an article on this topic a couple months ago on, let's see, what's the journal is called, what journal was that? Just Religions. It's Religions. It's an online open source journal. And that was a special issue dedicated and edited by James Sturba, who's a professor at Notre Dame. And I'm also working on something for the Air Force. It's for my research project for my master's degree with the Air Force. It's on is the existence of UAP or UFOs a threat to national security? So that's kind of what I'm doing right now. And for as far as research topics go and that kind of thing. So,
Nice. Yeah, I know you and I have talked about that a lot, and it's
yeah.
very interesting subject. So we'll have to talk some more about that another time, with especially since the Pentagon report has come out, and there's some more
Yeah, there's been a lot
information out
going
there.
on with it. Yep.
Yeah,
Mhm.
definitely. Well, Dr. Huffling has several blogs on the topic of divine simplicity, the attributes of God, classical theism. In fact, he has a recent blog post specifically addressing what we're going to talk about today, at least aspects of what we're going to talk about today, regarding Dr. Craig and Dr. White's comments from our last podcast about this
Yeah, having a
particular
podcast volley
subject.
going on here.
That's
Yep.
right. That's right. So tag, you're it kind of thing. And I should say at the outset, I hope if Dr. Craig listens to this, I hope to reach out to him soon to see if we can set something up officially to interact with him on these issues. Specifically, I think the issue of constituent ontologies, which we'll get into in our discussion today. And I have reached out to Dr. White on Facebook and on Twitter to try to interact with him as well, and have not had success in reaching him. So if he hears this, the invitation is open to him as well. So today we want to play a few specific clips from both of these brothers, and truly they are brothers. We want to obviously engage with this issue with graciousness, certainly not trying to be demeaning
Right.
in any way, just examining the ideas here, and specifically clearing up, I think, some misunderstandings or misconceptions, at least, with what divine simplicity is, specifically related to how we teach it at SES, because it certainly is a central issue for our theology proper, for that is when we're talking about the existence and nature of God. So bear with me if you're watching this live. I'll be switching back and forth to sharing my screen so I can play some audio clips and also some video clips, and we'll do the best we can to make that as smooth as possible. So, Dr. Huffling, anything you want to add before we jump into our first clip?
No, I think you said what I wanted to say, which was, I respect both Dr. White and Dr. Craig, and I really look up to them both as people in Christ and scholars. And so I've read a lot of their works, both their works, listened to their debates. They've both had an influence on me. So we don't mean anything demeaning by this, and we discuss them a lot, especially Dr. Craig a lot. So look up to them and just trying to have a Christ-like conversation.
Yeah, and for me, honestly, because both of these gentlemen are so well respected in various circles, people are going to naturally take them at their word for what they say, and I know they
Right.
they think they're saying accurately what it is that we teach and think at SES, and I just think they have some misconceptions, and so we want to make sure we clear that up. Maybe not so much for them, but for people who follow them, especially for people who may be
Right. Right.
considering SES, or even some of our current students who follow these guys and maybe have some confusion. So let's jump into our first clip, and this is again from a podcast within the last few weeks from Dr. Craig. And let me share my screen here. You can see my notes there, and hopefully this will work.
Strong doctrine of divine simplicity, it's become clear to me that simplicity is not really an attribute of God at all. Rather, it is a formal claim about God, namely that God has no composition in him. And therefore, he has no specific attributes like omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence, holiness, or simplicity itself. If God had the attribute of simplicity, he wouldn't be simple. That would be one of his many properties. So those who hold to a strong doctrine of simplicity don't really regard it as an attribute of God. It's rather the denial that God has any composition including composition of different attributes.
Okay, so let's stop it right there. So we have some, I think, equivocation going on here with properties and attributes and some different words being thrown around. But be that as it may, simplicity leads to God not having attributes, essentially. How do you respond to that?
From what I heard, he was saying that simplicity is not an attribute; it's a denial. It is a denial, much like eternality is a denial, immutability is a denial, impact. Anything that we say that God is not is going to be a denial. So God is not a body, God is not material, God is not changeable, and God's not passible, God's not temporal. These are all really denials of what he is. They're also considered attributes. I mean, simplicity is a negation of composition. So we look, for example, at the question from Aquinas, which is his third question on in his Summa Theologiae, for example. It's a series of 8 different negations, eight ways that he is that God is not composed in any way. For example, form, matter, body in any way, act and potency, essence and existence. So there's a sense in which we can say that simplicity is not a positive attribute, but that's the same thing we would say with, for example, impassibility or immutability. Interestingly, Dr. Craig would deny those in a strong sense. He thinks that God is passible and, at least in some ways, mutable, and certainly not eternal in the way that we would. And so these really are, and even infinite is a negative term for God, is not finite. So yeah, these are all in a sense negations of saying what God is not. In this sense, of saying that God is not composed. Maybe I was reading something in regards to this. Maybe I missed what you were saying that God doesn't have attributes because of this. If this is the clip that says that, then yeah, that no one in the Thomistic universe says that God doesn't have attributes. Aquinas calls them names. He doesn't call them attributes in the sense that we would. Certainly not properties, because a property would be akin to an accident that Aristotle would consider a part of a composition. And so in following Aristotle, Aquinas is going to say, yeah, God doesn't have properties or accidents in this regard. But we can say he has names, or in our more vernacular, characteristics or attributes, which were just descriptors of saying what God is. And so God being simple in no way means we can't describe him. What we're trying to do with this is say what he's not. He's not composed. He's not temporal. He's not changeable, not material, not finite.
Okay, and I think we'll get, as we go on, into a little more detail of why Dr. Craig would say this leads to God not having any attributes at all when he mentions the modal collapse and some of those sorts of things. So let's jump into this next clip, which I found very interesting. He was responding to when we were discussing thinking well about God and talking about divine simplicity and all these sorts of things being an act of worship.
Yeah.
And he essentially asserts that this strong notion of simplicity, as Aquinas holds and as we hold as well, ultimately leads to some type of mysticism.
Yeah.
So let me again share the screen and we'll play this clip.
But with respect to worship, I think that while it might lead you to a sort of mystical approach to God, where God is incomprehensible and beyond intelligibility, I don't see that as really worshipful. I think that kind of mysticism may be characteristic of certain Eastern religions, which think of God as absolutely simple and without any differentiation or properties. But I don't see that as being worthy of worship. I think that a God who is possessed of perfections like omnipotence and omniscience and holiness and goodness and all the rest is worthy of worship. And while he is incomprehensible in the sense that we cannot fully comprehend God, nevertheless, I think that we do have biblically a good idea of many of God's essential attributes. And so any view that would deny that God has these essential attributes, it seems to me, is not worshipful. It may be mystical, but I don't think that it's something that Christians should engage in.
Okay, so this Thomistic notion of divine simplicity leads to a God more akin to Eastern religions, who's mystical and not worthy of worship.
Yeah, well, just out of the gate, let me just say that we're not denying these biblical attributes. That's not what we're doing in Thomism. We're not saying we can't know things about God positively, and we're not saying that these biblical descriptions of God are wrong. Of course, we don't think that we're going to deny the Bible's view of God is wrong, or that God doesn't have these attributes, or that they're less real because of simplicity. But God has made us rational, as you point out. This is a very interesting comment by Dr. Craig. Thinking about God, this is what we think is going to happen in the beatific vision, and when we are quote unquote face to face with God and behold Him, we're going to, God's not a physical being, but we're going to somehow know Him directly, and it's the knowing God directly that is traditionally seen as an act of worship and being in awe of the divine essence. We have a class at SES. It's one of the more popular classes. It's ST means Systematic Theology 502, God and Creation. So back when I took it, I didn't know a lot about this kind of stuff. I was still getting used to all these terms and all the categories. My wife and I took the class together. And I had heard that the class really kind of blew away your expectations or whatever you thought God was like. And people had always described it as worship, being in worship. And people oftentimes think that, well, doing philosophy or theology is really just for people who have nothing else better to do or completely irrelevant. They're just in the high tower of academia doing whatever. And I found myself in my study, in my chair, reading a book about God. And when I start reading and contemplating these ideas of God, attributes, and whatever, it does tend to obliterate and blow away our conceptions of what God is, because I think we naturally think of God apart from natural revelation and thinking about it, but we just, in an uninformed way, come at it like God is just a bigger one of us, that God is a great being, or the greatest of all the beings among the beings. But when you start to strip away what God is not, that He's not temporal, physical, and all this, He's not temporal like we are, He's not changeable, He's not even affected like we are by things, He doesn't even know the way we know. So power, knowledge, all these things for God is not what it's like for us to be powerful or knowledgeable. Well, stripping away these limitations, at least to me and in my experience, and others have described the same thing, that is worship. It's thinking about God. God has what separates us from other animals is our ability to reason, and God has given us the ability to reason about God through nature. How is that not worship? It's not Eastern. It's not Eastern mysticism. It's, classical theism, and classical theism, contra Craig, does not equate to Thomism. The classical traditions and the notions of God are that He's a personal, loving, knowing creator being, which is nothing like Eastern mysticism. And so thinking about this and considering what God is, that is not only is it worship, it's a category of worship that I think has been completely or largely nowadays been set aside. I think it's one of the problems with the church is that to rip off J.I. Packer's book title, we don't know God in the way that we used to. I mean, traditionally, my understanding is that people had much deeper theological conversations, even at the bar, for example, or farmers had these deep understandings of what God is like, and nowadays many pastors don't. And it's disconcerting and disappointing to hear someone like Bill Craig, who's a scholar, say that thinking about God isn't worship. Now, maybe he doesn't mean it the way that he comes off sounding like it, but I think that thinking and pondering. That's what we're supposed to do. We're pondering the scriptures. We ponder what God is and is like. And of course, we're going to disagree on simplicity. But I think we should be able to agree that whatever God is and is not, thinking about that and trying to get at what he is an act of worship.
So how do you respond specifically to this idea that this strong view of simplicity, because God is unknowable, and specifically Aquinas says, and we teach that God is unknowable in himself as he is to us. He's unknowable to us. He is knowable in and of himself, but he's unknowable as he is to us. But that doesn't mean that he's unknowable completely.
Right.
So how do you respond to this charge that it's nothing but mysticism at the end of the day?
Yeah, well, for several things. One, a God that we can't know completely is simply a bigger and greater God than a God we would be able to check off all the boxes and put him in a box. I mean, God is an infinite being. And one thing that separates our view from Bill Craig's view and many others' view is that we don't take being in terms of a univocal sense, meaning that being of different the being of different categories or things that exist are not exactly the same. And so what it means for God to exist and what it means for us as finite material things to exist are not the same. I mean, we really don't even know what angels are. We have a description biblically and through reason as to what angels are, but angels are finite beings. They're created beings, but they're not physical. And because they're not physical is the reason why we have such a hard time kind of nailing down what they are. Because we are physical composed beings created to know the world directly. That's why we don't know God directly. We don't have any way to know an immaterial being directly. So we know about God through the conduit of nature and creation. This is what Romans 1 says. This is not a shocker for theologians and philosophers, but we know God through creation. It's almost the case, I would think, that knowing a being through another being like this, we're not going to know it directly or completely. But the only way to say that we can know God completely and him being infinite is for him just to be quantitatively bigger than we are in an infinite way. Well, we just deny that God's being is like our being. God is being in himself. We have being given to us. It's an accident to us, to use Aristotle's terms. It's something that we don't have to have, but God does have it because he's necessary. And so it would be a pretty small God to say we know all of God completely. And even saying that God's being is like ours really reduces him to our level. And there's the way that we're created to know through our sense faculties and through creation. It's just a necessary way we have to know God right now. Now, in the beatific vision, we're said that we're gonna know God directly, not in the way that we're going to see him with our eyes and hear him with our ears and those kind of things, but that we're going to somehow graciously, through God's just giving us the experience, know him directly. And then we are going to know, but even then we're not going to know him completely, never will. Even through an infinite amount of time, we're never going to know God completely. And so we are to deny that we have some level of agnosticism is going to necessarily reduce God's being to the same kind of being that we have, or the same level that we're on. I mean, to say we don't have, we're going to be able to comprehend God completely is just to reduce him to one of us. And so really it's in keeping him higher and loftier and giving him the honor that's due him to say, we don't know what. That's why God didn't want graven images. There's nothing that captures him. There's nothing that we can do or say that really captures him. But this negative theology, and we're not just rooted in all negative theology, but in saying God is not this, he's not that, we're chipping away what we think he would be and saying he's not like us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I agree with you completely about what you said with ST502, our systematic theology 2 class.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it obliterates your preconceived notions of
it takes your view of God and it just blows it up, and that's just worship. I mean, seeing God as bigger than what we think he is, and being corrected in our theology, what Paul talks about ad nauseum in the New Testament over and over again, beware of false theology. Well, how do you do it? Well, you got to think about good theology.
Mm-hmm.
And that includes theology proper.
Right.
So, yeah, I think that just getting rid of these false notions of what these limitations that many people think God has, that really would set up an idol. So you want to get rid of these idolatrous notions
Mm-hmm.
of God and worship the true God. And it's got to be worship.
Yeah. I agree. So in this next clip, and this, I guess, maybe plays into why Dr. Craig doesn't think thinking about simplicity is an act of worship.
Right.
He essentially asserts that it's an unbiblical notion because the Bible clearly talks about God having individual attributes and that God exists as a Trinity, which seems contradictory to simplicity. So again, let me share my screen and jump over to this clip.
What I'll hold to is biblical theism. And the Bible is very clear in ascribing to God different properties or attributes, such as the ones that I've mentioned. And I think that implicit in the teaching of the New Testament, moreover, is that God is three persons, that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are all distinct persons. So we can all agree that God is simple in a sort of innocuous, modest sense. Namely, God is not composed of more fundamental or separable parts. Of course, God isn't going to fall apart like a bag full of marbles with a hole in it. God is not composed of parts that can be separated. So God is indivisible or indissoluble. And if that's all you mean by simplicity, then it's unobjectionable.
Okay, let's stop it right there. So what are your thoughts? I don't even know what to ask exactly. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, again, we're not denying with biblical theism. Of course, the Bible ascribes God different attributes as does natural theology. We're not in any way denying God has multiple and distinct attributes. And are we going to discuss that in a different segment, or I can do it here? Because
yeah, no, feel free. He mentions that a few different times. So
okay,
yeah, feel free.
So what's really let me just say again, I will never be the scholar that Dr. Craig is. I've told him to his face, I really admire you. I was on a panel with him on this very topic back in 2018. I'm not just being mock-minded. I just watched a recording a couple nights ago about him discussing theism with atheists, and he's just amazing. And I'm so glad he's on our team. But what's disappointing with these very high level scholars is not, and it's not just him, it's several others out there, is that he's raising objections against simplicity that Aquinas raised to his own view and then answered. It's like, well, the third man argument against Plato is a big thing. Well, yeah, Plato recognized that in the Parmenides, and he at least attempted to discuss the answer. Now, I don't think his answer is very good, but he at least recognizes it. But here with Aquinas, in his own writings, he raises the objection of, or the question, are all the divine names synonymous? He does that both in the Summa Theologiae and in the Summa Contra Gentiles. In the Summa Theologiae, it's question 13, article 4. And then in the Contra Gentiles, I think it's book 1, chapter 31. And so what I would like to see, and one thing that he brought up in our panel discussion, I wish I had discussed this and really made it more clear, is that he said that you Thomas just read Thomas and think that's the answer. Well, no, not exactly. But we would like to see a development on these objections, because Aquinas raised the question / objection on many of these, not just the attribute synonymity question, but the modal collapse that he brings up later on. And I know he's aware of this because I discussed this in our talk on the panel in 2018, is that, okay, who really cares if a bunch of folks disagree with simplicity? No big deal, except that they have a huge following, and we want to make sure that we want people to believe that what we think is the truth, and that simplicity is true. But okay, so Bill Craig, James White, Ryan Mullins, whatever, don't believe in simplicity. Big whoop, right? That's their position, their prerogative. what my main complaint is not that they disagree with simplicity. My main complaint is that they're lodging objections that go back to Aquinas himself in the 13th century that he's already responded to and answered. And I don't even care if they disagree with his response. At least give their response that Aquinas himself provides for these very objections. I mean, the modal collapse, that all these attributes collapse into one big attribute or none at all. These go back to Aquinas. So what you got to say as an academic then is okay, simplicity has these problems, X, Y, and Z. Aquinas recognizes those problems, and here's how he responded to them, and here's why he's wrong in his response. That last point is what's missing in every discussion I've ever seen in writing or orally on this topic. It's the last point of here's what Aquinas says about the modal collapse, or here's what Aquinas says about the properties being all the same, and here's why he's wrong. I just don't remember seeing that in the literature, and that's the point that we want to progress. Planting it does a little bit better job, I think, and does God have a nature? But in general, people like Mullins, like Craig, and apparently now White are just saying, yeah, this sounds like a problem. Well, yeah, it's a problem that was anticipated in the 13th century that was brought up by Aquinas. So if you're going to reject it, fine, but at least tell us why Aquinas' response to these objections are wrong. That's my main complaint. Again, I will never be the scholar that these guys are going to be like Craig. All we ask is for academic integrity and honor in saying that here's our problem. And Aquinas thought it was a problem, so it's got to be at least on the surface of it seemed like a problem. But here's how he responds to it, and then here's why Aquinas is wrong. That's what we're asking for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know.
Now, did I answer your questions? I kind of got on a rant there.
No.
Everything you wanted me to say?
I think that is a great point, and
Okay.
I've talked about that quite a bit, which is frustrating when we have these conversations because we seem like we're saying the same things.
Right.
Over
It's not
and
that they
over.
disagree with it. I mean, fine, they disagree with it. But they're not. These are not new objections. They're not new, and they've been responses. So at least give us why you think the responses are wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just so we can take the conversation to that
Right.
next
Let's go to
level.
the next. And
deeper.
that's why I kept bringing up Aquinas and the panel, and why Bill thought I was just reciting chapter and verse, which I was trying to do to progress the discussion. I haven't ever heard Bill talk about, well, here's Aquinas' distinction between absolute and suppositional necessity. So what's wrong with it,
Mm-hmm.
for example?
Yeah. And I apologize. I'm sorry.
And we still didn't get an answer really enough, but go ahead, sorry.
Well, again, if he watches this, the invitation is open. I hope we can work something
Right.
out to have a formal discussion about this, either through this means or
Yeah. And I'm
whatever.
not just directing this just towards Bill. I mean, this is. It seemed like it's just the thing to do with simplicity is to bring up these same objections. So
Mhm.
my frustration is not just with him; it's with the whole discussion. And if I'm missing something, then feel free to point me in that direction. But I just can't remember seeing anything that goes into much detail about this. I mean, Chris Hughes has a major work on it. Planting Bill has things here and there. Nothing I think is overly dedicated to it. Maybe we're going to see it in his upcoming book on his theology book, but we'll see.
Right. And if you're watching this live, I apologize. I keep seeing the stream have a little pause here and there for some reason. I'm not sure why, but be that as it may, everything seems to be fine on this end. So I'm not sure what the technical issue would be.
I break the camera?
No, that would be me. All right. So this next clip, Dr. Craig is discussing the essence existence distinction, which obviously we make a big deal about with regards to simplicity and with regards to just arguing for the existence of God.
Mm-hmm.
And Dr. Craig claims it is in Aristotle merely a conceptual distinction. Aquinas tries to make it a real distinction, but never actually defends that position. So let me share my screen again. And this is a little bit longer clip. So
distinction between the thing's essence and its existence is drawn from Aristotle. And in Aristotle, this is a conceptual distinction. You can conceive of the nature essence of something without knowing whether there is such a thing. But for Thomists, this is not simply a conceptual distinction. It is a metaphysical distinction. Thomists hold to what's called a constituent ontology, where things are made up of ontological parts. And for the Thomist, all creaturely things are composed of essence and existence. And these are metaphysical parts of the thing. And the claim then is that in God, there is no such composition of essence and existence. God just is existence subsisting without any sort of limiting or restricting essence to this or that kind of thing. So that's the real bedrock metaphysically of this view is there merely a conceptual or is there a real distinction between essence and existence?
Okay. And like I said, he goes on to say that Aquinas never actually defended this position.
Yeah,
Before we jump into that, kudos to James White. He just messaged me on Facebook and said since we weren't friends, he found my message buried in that people trying to contact you thing. I know I forget to look there sometimes.
That's funny. He has no idea this was going on, I'm assuming.
No, he's apparently watching it. So,
oh, really? Okay,
yeah.
Good.
So kudos to him. So hello, Dr. White. Hopefully we can schedule something soon. All right. So essence, existence, real or conceptual?
Yeah, well, he is going to argue in several places. For example, On Being and Essence, his little book. It's a tiny little book. It was one of his earlier ones. And also in the Summa Theologiae, question 3, article 4. And I can read some of this. I can just give you the summation of it. Basically, what Aquinas is going to say is that if you have something like existence and essence as actually separate entities, then the existence would have to cause the essence to be what it is, because essence is, in a sense, prior, not temporally, but in order of being prior to an essence, because an essence couldn't exist without quote unquote existence. So the bottom line, and I can read some of what Aquinas has here if you'd like me to, but basically he's going to say that if God's essence and existence differ, then God will have to be caused or put together or composed. And that's the whole concern with simplicity, is that if God has these different ontological parts or these different constituent parts, then it's not just a matter of is God going to fall apart. It's a matter of God being caused and composed in various ways. So Aquinas says, for example, therefore, if the existence of a thing differs from its essence, this existence must be caused either by some exterior agent or by its essential principles. And so he goes in and he gives 3 different reasons for all this. But that's the bottom line, is that if the existence and essence are distinct, like they are both in people and in angels, then, or in all material things, and even immaterial like angels, then they have to be caused by something else. And if God has that, then God would not be caused. He would be caused by something else. Now, regarding the conceptual versus the real distinction, the best work to go to is On Being and Essence, written by Aquinas. And there are debates among Thomists as to, is this actually an argument for God's existence? And at what point do we move from a conceptual distinction to a real distinction? We have debates, for example, between Thomists like John Owens or Joseph Owens and Etienne Gilson. Gavin Kerr wrote a great book on this topic, arguing that there is what's called a deenta proof. Deenta means on being. Is the title of the book in Latin is deenta et essentia. So deenta proof refers to the proof from God's, from Aquinas' notion of God being simple in terms of his essence and existence. So there are many Thomists, not all, who think that this actually is a divine proof for God's being, not just a matter of him being simple.
Sorry, had to switch shots there.
Sorry.
Yeah, it gets very complicated. But, some of this, I think, in terms of the perspicuity of Scripture, for example, yeah, as Dr. Geisler would always say, the main things are the plain things, and the plain things are the main things. We don't have to get into every debate amongst Thomists on these specifics to understand the basics of what we're talking about and how Aquinas argues for these things. So for time's sake, I'm going to skip a few of these clips. There's one more from Craig I definitely want to get to, and then we'll jump into a few clips from Dr. White's video. So I think this one is important from Dr. Craig, specifically on God's relation or not to creation.
Okay.
Leads to. Now, in terms of the claim that God does not cause things, love things, or know things, that's not an objection. That's Thomism. That's what Thomas Aquinas affirms. You see, he says that God stands in no real relations to the world, and therefore he is not related to things really as cause to effect, knower to known, lover to loved. Rather, these relations exist only in creatures. Thomas's paradoxical doctrine is that while creatures are effects of God, God is not the cause of creatures. While creatures are known by God, God does not know creatures. While creatures are beloved of God, God does not love creatures. These properties or relations exist only in the creatures themselves. And I think this is a paradoxical doctrine that is not only unbiblical, but incomprehensible. And it has a very, very negative consequence that is usually goes under the label, the modal collapse argument or objection. What is the modal collapse objection? It is that if all of God's knowledge and causal activity is essential to him, if God has no contingent properties, but everything that he knows, does, is essential to him, then that means that this is the only possible world, that God could not have done anything different. He could not have known anything different. And so, since God knows every true proposition, that means that every true proposition is necessarily true. There is no world, no possible world in which that proposition is false, because then God would have different knowledge than he does. And so this doctrine leads to a modal collapse that implies logical fatalism, that everything that happens necessarily.
Well, there's a lot there. And
yeah, I was going to say that's a lot to respond to. Yeah.
I would say if that were the idea of God that I was presented, I wouldn't want to worship that God either.
Right.
So what is this notion about God being related or not to his creation? And then we'll get into a little bit of modal collapse.
So there are different kinds of relations that both Aristotle and Aquinas talk about. One is real, like father and son. They have a real relationship. One is logical. To use a more mundane example, so the knowledge. So if I know my microphone here, I have a logical relationship to my microphone because my knowledge of it depends on the microphone. What the microphone doesn't depend on me at all. And so what Aquinas is trying to deny in regards to the God being really related in that regards is simply to say that God is not dependent on creation. It's not Aquinas never denies God as cause. I mean, remember the question on simplicity is question 3 in the Summa Theologiae. His arguments for God being the cause, and he gives 5 ways. Most people are familiar with his 5 ways. Is question 2. So unless we're going to think that Aquinas has either made a huge contradiction or bumped his head and lost his mind between writing question 2 and question 3, or got Alzheimer's or something, he doesn't mean with the obvious contradiction. There's a principle in philosophy called the principle of charity. Now, the principle of charity says that if there's multiple ways of taking something, while you're reading something off a page, for example, and one leads to a blatant contradiction, and another one does not, then we should be charitable to the one writing. This is a horribly uncharitable position to take against Aquinas, who's arguably the most detailed, and I'm not Catholic, so James, if you're watching, don't flip on me. One of the greatest thinkers in the church that we have in terms of philosophy and just in terms of scope and depth. So to think that he has just flipped and made a huge contradiction from question 2 to question 3 is extremely uncharitable. All Aquinas means, and he says this, for example, I'm going to read this real quick from question 13, and everything is in a very consecutive, deductive order here in the Summa. So when we read question 13, we've got to read it in light of question 3, which is also written in light of question 2. Okay, so in question 13, article 7, Aquinas says this: since therefore God is outside the whole order of creation, and all creatures are ordered to him, and not conversely, meaning that creation is ordered with a telos or an end goal toward God, and not from God having a goal toward creation. It is manifest that creatures are really related to God himself, whereas in God there is no real relation to creatures, but a relation only an idea, inasmuch as creatures are referred to him, or geared toward him, aimed toward him, dependent on him. That's all he's denying here. Thus, there is nothing to prevent these names, attributes, what Aquinas calls names, which import relation to the creature from being predicated of God temporally, not by reason of any change in him, but by reason of the change of the creature. As a column is on the right of an animal without change in itself, but by change in the animal. All right. So it's not part of God's, what Aquinas is trying to say here is God is just in no way dependent on creation for anything. All right. He is completely a se or independent of anything that is needed for him. He doesn't need anything else. He didn't have to create. And so being creator is not it's not part of his essence. All right. So God is not creator because of his essence, or he would have to create by necessity. And contra Craig, Aquinas does not teach that God had to create by necessity. He creates volitionally because he wanted to. Okay, so Christ is not Savior by his nature. He's Savior because he willed to save us through his actions. And so God being creator, God being Lord, God being Savior, these are not inherent or essential qualities for him, but they're qualities that he takes on because he's created us. Okay. And so him being creator is a relation. He does create and he causes the effects. Again, this is what he says in question 2, 5 different ways very clearly. And so he's not going to make a flat contradiction within writing the very next question. What he means here is simply that, yes, God creates, God knows, question 14, God knows things. God is involved, God is providential, God loves, God is good. It's interesting, if what Bill Craig was saying was correct, then Aquinas, just a few questions after he said, just one question after all this would be false. So to be charitable to Aquinas, one of the greatest thinkers in church history, he's just not going to make these ridiculous contradictions. What we're going to have to say is, okay, is there another way he can mean this? Well, he even says what he means. He says what he means. He says that God is related in a way. Yes, he's a cause. He's a knower. He's a lover in the sense of he loves things. That's not denied in saying God is not really related. What's denied is a relation of dependency. Like my knowledge is dependent on the microphone, but not the reverse. Of course, it goes more than just to knowledge. It goes all the way into being creator and everything else.
Which, because of simplicity, means he is goodness itself and love itself, and he knows us more intimately than we know ourselves.
And that's a great point. And that's a great point, because again, this goes back to our distinction. And when we had our panel back in 18, almost the entire panel hinged around our difference between being univocal or analogical. And so, yeah, for God to know, for Bill Craig, means more of a passive way, because after God created, or once the universe is created for Craig, God enters into temporal relations, and Craig explicitly denies impassibility. And so, Craig, how come God is temporal? Well, because we're temporal and we're doing things. So I'm uttering this statement, I'm hitting my desk, I'm touching my microphone, all these different things, talking to you. Well, for God to know what we're doing, he's got to know that what we're doing right now in a temporal way. So for God to know, for God to love, and all this kind of stuff is just, it's a very univocal way of looking at it. And what you just said is exactly right for a Thomist or even a classical theist. You don't have to be. He says that Thomists make classical theism just identical. And that's just not true at all. We can go back to Anselm and Augustine. That's not exactly what Craig means, and what they mean is not the same. So for God to know, love, all this is just not what we mean to know. So God's knowledge is not a passive activity that happens to God. It's just what God is, and it's an action that he performs through his knowledge and causal activity. Now, I don't know if you want to go into the modal collapse again. Aquinas responds to this in various places, both in the Summa Theologiae and the Contra Gentiles. It's back in the 13th century. This is not new. It's passed off as new by a lot of different people. He's not the only one doing it. R.T. Mullins is doing the same thing. People do it all the time. And again, it doesn't matter. Our beef isn't, do you agree with simplicity? It's, are you being fair to our position? Are you being fair to Aquinas? And are you being fair to your followers? Because people are going to go, people who follow these big name guys are not going to probably go and read a 13th century document just to check them off, see if they're saying what's true. All we ask is that you be honest and say, okay, these are objections that are being given to us now, and they're on the surface good, thoughtful objections, but they're objections that were brought up by Aquinas in the 13th century and answered by him. So if you're gonna say things like God can't have multiple attributes if simplicity is true, and question 13, Article 7 raises that and denies that, and chapter 31 of the first book of the Summa Contra Gentiles raises that and answers it, then at least explain why Aquinas's answers and refutations of these are wrong in some way.
Yeah,
that's all we're asking.
I agree completely, and we'll leave the modal collapse at that for now. So thank you so much for that, and again, Dr. Craig, thank you for interacting with us, and I hope we can do that more in a formal format if you're willing and interested in that. And Dr. White, since you're still Facebooking me, I'm glad you're watching. So we're going to jump into your video.
I can just say, since you're watching, Dr. White, I've been a fan of yours since high school, probably college, I think, at least. Read a lot of your books. You've been very influential on me. You've made me go at the time from not a thoughtful Christian to a 5-point Calvinist, and then I hold more of David Allen's view. I don't even interact with him on social media, but I've watched a lot of your debates, so you've had a very powerful influence on me as a Christian and a thinker. So thank you. I appreciate what you do.
Kudos. Very good. And for the record, he did ask me to say, and I didn't mean to imply this, because he says this in his video, and I know exactly what he means, that like Dr. Craig, Dr. White does not deny simplicity. He denies the Thomistic view of simplicity, the way at least that we're articulating it here. So let's jump into a few clips from Dr. White. And whoops, let me share my screen first, and then we'll do that.
As Aquinas evidently takes this results in the thing that Jake was talking about, the idea that you cannot discuss the attributes of God in a way that would make them different from one another, because that then becomes parts, which denies the simplicity of God. So God's omniscience is his omnipresence. You can't distinguish them. And I'm like, and basically Craig was saying, that doesn't make any sense. And I'm sitting there going, yeah, he's right. It doesn't make any sense. And yet that's this classical theism stuff that's being presented now. And it's Aquinas's formulation. Now, I've talked about Aquinas over the years.
Let's go ahead and stop it right there. So this classical theism stuff that basically just doesn't make any sense, because kind of back to the modal collapse. It just collapses all of God's attributes into meaning his knowledge is his love, is his power, is his
Right.
all these things.
Right.
Where's the misunderstanding?
Okay, so what Craig was saying that I think White was agreeing with, that James was agreeing with, is that the idea here is that if simplicity is true, we have to deny multiple attributes for God. And Aquinas just flat out rejects that notion. He does it in a couple places. Again, I said this earlier in the podcast, but in question 13 of the Summa Theologiae, Article 4, and in chapter 31, I believe it is, of the first book of the Summa Contra Gentiles, he says, the question is whether names, that means attributes, whether names or attributes apply to God are synonymous. In other words, well, he's not even raising any objection here. It says that it seems the objection is that it seems that these names or attributes applied to God are synonymous, because for synonymous names are those which mean exactly the same, but the names applied to God mean entirely the same thing in God per simplicity. For the goodness of God is his essence, and likewise his wisdom, and so forth. That's pretty much the objection. Plantinga gave this objection in his Does God Have a Nature back in, I think it was 80 or 81. And it's been brought up. I mean, again, Aquinas sees this in the 13th century. So he denies it. And what he's going to say is that they're not synonymous, because what the definition of these various attributes are, just by definition, means something different. So, for example, power, love, knowledge, whatever you want to say, as we understand them and as we mean them and pick out, mean something different, one attribute from another. Okay. But what we're doing is trying to describe the one infinite unity of God that's undifferentiated. And we're going to say that there's no distinction in God of all these things, because it's not like God is put together of these various parts, like, well, part of God is knowledge, part of God is goodness, part of God is love, wisdom, or whatever. All these are just descriptions of the one being of God. And so what Aquinas' main point is that we know things through creation and through the world in a composed and complex way, because that's how our noetic process works. We have both an intellect and senses from which we can know trees and stars, and can infer things like Romans 1 tells us about knowing God's nature and power, divine nature, eternal power. But in God himself, God is a simple, undifferentiated unity that all these different descriptors, names, attributes pick out, that they describe. So when we say God is X, Y, and Z, whatever attribute X, Y, and Z want to be, love, knowledge, power, whatever, we're not picking out parts of God, we're picking out all of God. So what Aquinas is saying is that, yeah, our minds know things through composition, but ultimately we arrive at a knowledge of a simple being through our knowledge of composed things. And when we're picking out these attributes, the way we define them are not synonymous, but in God, they are identical to the divine being and divine essence, because it's not put together of these various parts. I mean, there's no such thing as just this knowledge that God has compartmentalized, or omnipresence compartmentalized, or love. We're describing all of God, not parts of God.
So
is that what you wanted me to get at?
Yeah, well, it is, and it's such an abstract thing to talk about that it is very difficult.
It's difficult because we're kind of cultured into thinking scientifically in terms of biology and chemistry and all this, because our culture, being born in the 20th and 21st century, people are just conditioned because of our culture, because of all of our technology. Thinking philosophically has been rightly called a habit. It's a different way of thinking that most people don't culture and cultivate. But so it's very abstract. It's very different. And so these things sound, well, to use the word abstract, or just far out there and kind of weird and crazy to the non-philosophical. But once we get down to what we're talking about, this is all going to become very philosophical in its nature, as are a lot of things, like the nature of interpretation of the Bible, for example.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of philosophical and theological, a lot of theological things are going to have a philosophical aspect and component, even interpretation.
Sure. And of course, there's much more to get into here. We can only scratch the
We're
surface.
just scratching the very tip of it. Yeah.
And so hopefully we can have some more interactions
That's right.
with these guys. But I definitely want to get to this clip because we get a lot of flack at SES for leading people to Catholicism because we talk about Aquinas too much and these sorts of ideas. So I want to get to this clip and have you respond.
Thanks.
And we've talked about I don't even know how to describe it, but the absolute centrality of Aquinas to everything at Southern Evangelical Seminary. I mean, it's just he's not just a patron saint, he's almost a central figure there. And what the result of that has been, and it's not been a good result. I mean, when you have enough of your seminary graduates and former employees who become Roman Catholics to write a book, that probably indicates you lost your balance someplace along the way. And Aquinas was the gateway drug for those folks. And they all said it in their book. I listened to their book. They all said, yep, it was Aquinas that got me thinking along these paths, these lines.
All right, so let's just stop it there. And we've responded to this, and I saw your question, and we like to keep these to about an hour, but I think these are some important clips, so we can go, and we're not on a time crunch with the live stream, so people can listen at their leisure and go back and watch the archive if they want, or the podcast. So we've responded to this, the similar types of charges a number of times. But what are your thoughts?
Okay,
today?
So I was a student at SES along with my wife for several years. From 2004, I triple majored in a master's program. I majored in apologetics, philosophy, and biblical studies. So I took about every class SES has to offer, minus the pastoral classes. I didn't take the pastoral route. I took a more academic route. Then I got a PhD from SES, and I've been teaching there for a while. So I've taken all the systematic theology classes they've had, all the interpretation classes they've had, and I know a lot of the folks who have converted because for whatever reason to Catholicism. Now, I don't want to go into their personal lives, but the ones that I know did not convert because they had any specific doctrine that SES was teaching about Aquinas. I know people who have, I'm not going to go into personal lives. There's more to it than people probably have said in that book or have said on YouTube or said, but because some of these things it's not always pretty sometimes, what the reasons what these things are. Well, for example, there was one person that I was in class with, a PhD level class. I won't use his name. Maybe he said in his book. I don't know. I haven't read the book. He did his paper and presentation on the canon of the New Testament Gospels, and I think maybe even the Whole New Testament, perhaps. I don't know. He converted to Catholicism not because of anything we have ever taught about Aquinas, but because he came to some realization that the Protestant Church does not have the authority to pick out the books of the Bible or to lay out the canon. Okay. And there have been other people who have gone off to other places. I mean, one of our professors who became a Catholic went to a Catholic school, okay, St. Louis University, and got his PhD there. So, I mean, that's not all SES. And I would just defy anyone to tell me anything that SES has ever taught in a systematic theology class or anything else that says that doctrine or that teaching led me to Catholicism. Now, people may become enamored with Aquinas, and I respect Aquinas as well, but here's our overall position with Aquinas. When it comes to general revelation, we are generally Thomistic. And even Aristotle, we're not pagan Greeks either, but we hold to a general Thomistic view of things like philosophy of just reality, knowledge, philosophy of man, and so forth. Of course, that does not mean we divorce the Protestant evangelical view of sin or biblical view of man. We just don't do that. And we don't agree with Aquinas on everything. So when it comes to specifically issues of special revelation in the Bible, we're not Thomistic. So like we don't hold Aquinas' view of the church, of sin, of salvation, of the end times. And I've never heard anything taught in any of my theology classes that made me even consider Catholicism. The only thing that's really taught from a Thomistic point of view is our philosophical notion of reality, that things are composed of form and matter, things of prolegomena and theology proper that even historically the reformers have held to, and reformers today in Reformed traditions. I know James refers to some of these guys. There's nothing really that's in the first few questions, the first dozen or maybe 24 questions in the Summa Theologiae that I know of that are inherently contrary to Protestant teaching, at least not in the first few questions, which is mainly what we're concerned about. And so, yeah, there are people who have gone from SCS and become Catholic. They've also left and become atheists too. I don't think that's our fault of them becoming atheists. And people have left Reform schools and become Catholic as well. But people who go on to become enamored with Aquinas, they don't get that extra push from SCS. In fact, when we find out that people are Catholic, they're not here anymore. If we're so Catholic, where are all the Catholic people? They're not here because they left. They're not getting that from SCS. They're getting that from SCS plus whatever they're learning outside of the school, because we're not Thomistic. We're not full-blown Thomists. We're Thomistic and some views, not even all our views, and mainly when it comes to views of a general revelation, not special revelation. So God, our sin, salvation, the church, last things, we're not Thomistic in these regards at all. And I don't think anybody's going to be able to point out anything in our theology classes that says, this is why I became a Thomist. People become a Thomist because they like I've heard this from people. I'm telling you, the people I've talked to, not a single one has ever said, this is from SCS. They like the aesthetics of the Catholic Church. They like the historical tradition of the Catholic Church. I could give you some more examples that are very clear, but I don't want to get too personal because it does get pretty personal. People's wives being Catholic and they want to be happy with their wife, going to other Catholic schools, whatever. I just defy anybody to tell me, because I'm a product of SCS, and SCS is an evangelical Protestant school, and we do not teach anything that explicitly endorses Catholic teaching to the exclusion or the contradiction to Protestant teaching. We're wholeheartedly evangelical, but there's some aspects of Protestantism that is not contrary to Catholic teaching, like the Trinity, for example, or the Incarnation, and our prolegomena or theology proper. I know I'm going to get off. I'm going to forget. I'm going to say, man, I wish I said that. But I just wish that people, if they're going to go on places like, I remember Scott Oliphant did this a few years ago. If you're going to just take their word for it, I mean, why not come and get our side too? This is just journalism. You go to both people you're talking about and say, okay, this is what they're saying. I can pretty much guarantee you they're probably not going to say anything in that book that's too self-deprecating. And I know at least some, maybe not even in the book, I don't know, that are there because of very personal issues, had nothing to do with theology.
Yeah, I agree. I know some of the same people, and have been obviously a product of SCS as well. So
and we are talking about a very small number compared to all the graduates we have. And this can be said of any school on any topic.
Right. Yeah, there's this notion out there that, half of our students are going off and becoming Catholic or something. We can count them on probably two hands, the number of people that we're talking about, at least that I know of. So
the ratio is very small, and there's nothing they're getting from our theology classes. I can guarantee it because I've been through them.
That's right. Yep. All right, let's go to our final clip, and this is, we're getting some questions and stuff, but we're already going long, so feel free if you want to ask your questions on the Facebook post. We'll do our best to respond to those within the post, but we're already going along with the show, so probably too long to bring them up here. But I'm not sure why I'm getting echo all of a sudden. Let me play this last clip and we'll call it a day.
It seems to me that Reformed guys are just overwhelmed with his brilliance, and as a result can't see the fundamentally compromised foundation upon which he stands, which comes from a fundamentally compromised epistemology, which comes from a fundamentally compromised anthropology in regards to what the gospel is. So I know there are Reformed guys. RC loved Aquinas. There are Reformed guys that try to read into Aquinas, but there's just too much there that is thoroughly problematic to really rescue him. And so I am concerned because I'm seeing in a lot of Presbyterian circles, but Baptist circles as well, Reformed Baptist circles, this move toward a Thomistic emphasis where you transition the necessary fundamental foundational assertion of God's absolute monotheism. There is only one being of God. God's being is not complex. It's not made up of lesser subordinate parts that come together to create a greater whole. That's absolutely true. But it does not follow that a description of that being of God, such as his omnipresence or his omniscience, is an assertion that those things have being outside of God's being, so that they are some lesser item. That simply does not follow.
Okay, so we have a compromised foundation and conclusions that simply don't follow from simplicity. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, and I agree with that last part, because he said that these attributes, or I forgot the word he used, they don't point to things outside of God, and we agree with that. And we don't see them as parts either. Our concern is that he wants to maintain divine simplicity, which we do as well. But our fear is that these other areas that are not always as explicit sometimes also causes concerns about God being not just complex but composed. And if he's composed by something else. Like the various ways Aquinas says that God cannot be composed: form and matter, substance and accident, essence and existence. He has to be wholly and completely simple, that is undifferentiated and not composed or complex in any way. I don't know what James means by compromised epistemology and anthropology. I'm not sure what he means by that. But I agree with the last part, and we agree that these things aren't ontologically separate from God, but they just, and they're not synonymous in our definitional way of talking about them, but they are identical to the divine essence in a unified, simple way. So I'd love to know what you mean, James, by that.
Well, this may at least get us there.
Okay.
So he's asking, don't you think that elevating Aquinas to the position SES has leads one to consider his commitment to Rome's Synergism to be less objectionable? If he was the greatest Christian thinker, for me. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, I mean, that's not an unfair question. I've been here again since 2001. I'm not a synergist myself. I hold, as you do, that election is completely the act and prerogative of God. It's not foreseen by God down the road. It's not passive. God elects people, and then if the Father hasn't drawn us to Him, I love being able to say this to you because I've read your books and you're the one who helped me get to this point. That the Father, if the Father hasn't drawn someone to Christ, well, I said the opposite way. All the Father has drawn will come. And so if people don't come, then they're not drawn. I mean, and other professors, I've heard Tom Howe say this, people I look up to greatly. I'll just put it this way. I've never heard anyone, professor or student, say that a Roman Catholic view of any kind of soteriology looks more appetitive or appetizing because of our view of theology proper or our philosophical notions of metaphysics or epistemology. In fact, we're very careful to guard against that and say that, we're Thomistic in these certain areas, but not across the board. We're wholeheartedly Protestant and evangelical. and that we hold to the substitutionary atonement of Christ, not the atonement that Aquinas held to, which is kind of a modified Anselmian satisfaction theory. We don't hold his amillennialism. We don't hold to his view of the church, last thing. So the short answer is someone may get caught off in that regard, but it's nothing that SES has said. And it's nothing that we would teach. And it's everything that we teach against in our theology classes. So I've seen a lot of people come through the programs. I've been here for 17 years now, I guess, going on. And that's just not been, I have never seen that I can think of. What I have seen, though, are people who come out as better thinkers and hopefully more classical in their views of God. And actually people who are more aware of the Catholic view and can speak against it. Because just like you, and I appreciate what you do in this regard, I love you. I wish you could talk face to face. We agree with you 100%, or at least I do, in terms of what we do, in terms of our Protestant evangelical thinking. Now, I don't hold limited atonement anymore. I hold, again, more toward David Allen view. I got to debate someone on that a few years ago, I guess now, on that topic. But we hold wholeheartedly to total depravity and divine election, unconditional election, and all that, what we would call eternal security. And so this is not a Catholic teaching. And no, I just haven't seen it as a matter of experience. But I think the worry is, it's not an unfair question, but it's not one that I've seen borne out by experience. Because I think SES has done such a great job counteracting that. But you're not going to catch everybody. I mean, you're going to get some people who are going to become Hindu. We've seen that happen, not from SES, but in Christian apologetics. People have become Hindu. People have lost their faith completely. People have become Catholic, even from other non-SES schools, reform schools. So we're not going to get everybody, and there's just a lot more there than meets the eye, as the transformers say. There's just a lot of familial issues there, personal issues that you just don't see. And I've never heard of anybody saying it was this doctrine I got from SES, or even this doctrine from Aquinas. Other than it's just they like the aesthetics and like the tradition. Those are the two main things I see: the aesthetics of the Catholic Church and the tradition.
Yeah,
and we don't teach that.
For me personally, I barely even knew who Aquinas was when I started at SES.
And we do not teach Aquinas' view of soteriology and hamartiology and all this kind of stuff. That's just, and if it's taught to counter it. We don't. Right. We are wholeheartedly Protestant evangelical in our views in these areas.
Yeah, but
I appreciate the opportunity to be able to discuss it.
As I was learning some of the Thomistic thinking and falling in love with the key aspects that we were talking about earlier, I also had enough common sense to know, well, these guys are evangelical. They don't buy into all of this stuff. So there must be a reason for that. So let me examine what that reason is and go from there. It's not like there's Aquinas. So let me just swallow everything that he says.
Exactly. Is that what we know from general revelation, reason in the world is broadly Thomistic in this philosophical notion, but when it comes to special revelation in the Bible, we're wholeheartedly Protestant. And there's a lot of things that the Protestant Church and the Catholic Church just can agree on.
Yeah. And I'm a big proponent of natural law, especially as it relates to homosexuality, LGBT stuff, critical race theory, all these sorts of things. And, it's just, frankly, a mark against the Protestant Church for not thinking well about these issues. And I can't help it that the Catholic Church is often the
and what we want to do is keep people in an evangelical Protestant mindset and teaching, while also guarding against process theology and making God out to be a man. Because I think the biggest problem in the Protestant churches is pastors not teaching intellectually and getting people to think, and then we start worshiping what is lesser than a God.
That's right.
And make God into our image, and that's the real worry. James, I don't know if you remember, we met briefly when you were here for the white debate. For the white-brown debate in the basement. You were next to Richard Howe, and I was next to you. So it was a pleasure meeting you that time, and pleasure and treat to get to kind of talk to you now. So thank you very much.
Let's work something out. I think that'd be a lot of fun.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
It'd be a good discussion. So final thoughts. What would you like to leave people with? I know we've covered a lot of ground and talked about a lot of things.
I guess if people are seriously looking at Aquinas, and especially his simplicity, if you're concerned with these different attribute problems, go back and see what Aquinas has to say. I've written on my blog some. It's just myname.com. But
That would be brianhuffling.com, not
right,
literally
brianhuffling.com,
my name.
not my name. But yeah, brianhuffling.com. But go back to the horse's mouth and see what Aquinas says on that. Just as a general rule of being academic and being, charitable. And then Geiser has a great book on Aquinas. Should he be forgotten? An evangelical appraisal of Aquinas and different people. So go read that, and be familiar with your views and others around you, and just try to worship God best you can.
Awesome.
With your mind and everything you have.
Well, Dr. Huffling, I appreciate you. I appreciate your friendship, and thanks for all you're doing.
Yeah, likewise.
And again, brianhuffling.com, and we'll cross-post your most recent blog to the SES blog at ses.edu. So thanks again for taking the time to be with us, Dr. Huffling. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation. Thank you for those who are posting on Facebook and asking questions. We'll try to jump in there and answer some of those questions momentarily. Dr. White, Dr. Craig, we'd love to connect with you and get something scheduled. That would be great if you guys are interested in doing that. For everybody else, if you're interested in learning more about becoming a student, whether that's for a degree program, for a certificate program, auditing classes, whatever that looks like for you, I would encourage you to visit degrees.ses.edu/podcast, degrees.ses.edu/podcast. You can download a free ebook to help you understand a little bit more about what makes SES unique, specifically as we try to equip people to proclaim the gospel, engage the culture, and defend the truth. That's degrees.ses.edu/podcast. And as always, we can't do this without your support, whether that be prayerfully or financially. So we would love for you to visit ses.edu to learn more about the ways you can partner with us and keep this ministry going, keep students being prepared and equipped. As always, we call the show Why Do You Believe? And the only reason to believe anything is because it's true. So go share truth with someone today.
Providing an integrated approach to theology, philosophy, and apologetics that will equip you to proclaim the gospel, engage the culture, and defend the truth. That's SES.